Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to have this. I think it's one that sometimes people often find really difficult because I am the person that people come to when we want to talk about things like racism and sexism and ableism. And I always say that a problem that we can't talk about is one that we can't do anything about. To actually welcome these difficult conversations because of the ways that they can transform us. So often we listen to other people with the intent to respond and not the intent to be changed. And so I want to support us in engaging in a conversation about what it looks like to implement these ideas or a strategy around infusing diversity and inclusion into workspaces, into corporate spaces, into nonprofit spaces. So I always feel like the first place that we start whenever we're introducing a new idea is to talk about the broader context. And sometimes in workspaces, we can be focusing on everything but. So the entire world can be engaged in a conversation that's about something that is very pressing, that is about the ways in which people are moving through the world. But sometimes, whether it's US or Canada, we can be, I think Canadians in particular, it's one of the things I love about being from Canada, but we can want to really avoid getting into these difficult conversations because we don't feel as though it's maybe the most polite thing to do or the nicest thing to do. But again, when we move forward with these conversations, we're able to transform our cultural landscapes. So it's about then identifying what our goals are. What are we trying to do that's different from before? We are literally trying to create a world and a workspace that is more ethical than the ones that we were born into. So this isn't about establishing ideas of equality, and equality means that everyone gets treated the exact same way, but rather about creating a culture of equity, one where people are treated how they need to be treated based on the very specific accommodations that each person has. And this means we're actually able to create spaces that are responsive to individuals' needs, but also broadly open up and support people better. And the importance of establishing these kinds of goals, I think, is so valuable because it really is a matter of understanding that this change is coming whether we want it or not, whether we are open to it or not. So it really is a matter of letting go and embracing or being dragged into a situation. And I think about this, a few years ago, the TTC was confronted with a passenger who wanted the bus driver to let them know what the next stop was. And the person in the moment decided that they didn't want to do that. And then they ended up taking a massive court case to the TTC, which meant that they had to re-outfit all of their subways, all of their buses, so that now we all hear each stop being announced, right? And there's so much value for everybody, for every single person, not just people who might be deaf or people who might be blind, but for every single person who hears that, it's valuable. And this is the thing, when we design for inclusivity, we raise the quality of experience for every single user, not just the most vulnerable ones. But that's why it's so valuable to use people who are most vulnerable and who require an enormous kind of need to really be a litmus test for how we can really meet our clients and our employees where they're at. It's also about establishing language. Even when we talk about things like inclusion and diversity, sometimes we're not talking about things like racism or systemic barriers, but all of these things have to be a part of that conversation. And even when it comes to things like gender and language, I live between the US and Canada, and for me, my favorite American import is the way that Americans say y'all. I think it's like the sweetest, most warm way of addressing a group of people. But there are so many ways that we can just individually shift our language, really at no expense to ourselves, to create a space that is more open for people who have diverse genders or who have diverse experiences in the world. For me, it comes to this core of reframing the golden rule. And the golden rule is often the very first place that we learn about what respect looks like. We learn that we should treat people the way that we want to be treated. And that's a good start, but the challenge with that is that it assumes that we're the standard for other people's experiences, and we're not. So instead, I invite us to treat people the way that they want to be treated, which means we have to ask, which means we actually have to be in dialogue with one another, and it can be in small ways or big ways. It can be as simple as the ways that we treat each other in our day-to-day interactions, to consider how we can do that in a way that centers someone else's needs as opposed to imposing our own strategies. And if we understand that intersectionality, and intersectionality really is a language that gives us a way of describing that people who have a unique experience of racism or sexism are treated particularly vulnerably by institutions. And so when we understand that intersectionality comes into play for me as a woman of color, as a queer woman of color, or for a disabled person of color, that when we recognize that those people have a unique kinds of insight that allows us to create better workspaces, more responsive workspaces, and when we can tap into that, we can create a really consistent feedback loop where we're growing with the knowledge that's around us. So it's not only that we should value being institutionally educated, but it's also that we have value in being community educated, in being educated by the people who are around us about how we can best create these spaces. And that's why I always think it's so important when we are creating these kinds of spaces in our workspaces to create the opportunity for anonymous feedback loops. I love this campaign. It was really great. A group of Sikh men did it, and they all were wearing these shirts talking about how they were 100% randomly searched at the following airports. And the thing is that I think that humor is a really beautiful strategy for engaging and opening up a conversation that we all probably feel like we don't quite know how to have. But what it means is that when we create anonymous feedback loops, we create opportunities for people to tell us firsthand about what their lived experiences are without having to face any kind of penalty, whether it be social or economic. We see how people who are whistleblowers are not always treated very fairly. And I think it's important that we understand that, especially as an individual who may be coming into a workspace and they may be the only person who is like them, that they want to spend their time building authentic relationships with people and not expressing critique about how the space doesn't actually accommodate them. But when we do this, this allows us to create an opportunity for people to do that again without being worried how it might impact their jobs or their relationships with the people around them. Implicit bias is the primary barrier to the ways in which we might treat each other. And I think that sometimes we are unaware of how these things function. A lot of the time we get really obsessed with this idea of determining who is a racist or who is not a racist, or who is sexist and who is not sexist. We can do this idea of pathologizing or putting people on pedestals. And pathologizing can look like critiquing someone entirely and saying this is the person and this is the reason, this is the thing that is wrong with the world, or look at this person, he's doing it right and this is everything that's right with the world. And the truth of it is neither is accurate. We are all making mistakes. We all have positions of privilege and access and power, and when we don't actually talk about those things and instead are focusing on individuals, we're not addressing how implicit bias impacts the way we treat everybody around us. And so this is one example. Managers use more positive words to describe men in performance reviews and more negative ones to describe women. And you can see it's a really substantial difference. Words that are used to describe men include things like analytical or versatile or confident. And only 2 words are used to describe men in negative ways, as being arrogant or irresponsible. But the words that are used to describe women, again, there's a huge shortage of positive words to describe women's performance in the workspace, and so many ways that we describe women's performance as actually being inept or selfish or frivolous or gossip. The idea that these kinds of languages are being used to describe women, again, means that even in a performance review, which ideally should be something that is objective and based purely on someone's performance, even in that space, it's colored by a particular kind of bias. And it's not just that male managers are the ones who are only performing the performance reviews. Even when women managers are performing the performance reviews, we still see this issue. So it isn't enough to just say we need more women or more men in certain positions, when in truth we do need a gender balance and gender parity. It's also that we need to shift the culture in the spaces that we work in, to interrogate the ways in which our own prejudice can create this kind of context and make it very difficult for all of us to succeed in ways that are even and balanced. It looks like only 2 Fortune 500 CEOs are women of color. 2. That's a small, small percentage. And if we recognize that there are all of these barriers that start from that first performance review that go all the way up to who's mentoring who and what rooms are we being invited into. One of the women who works at Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg's sister, was describing her experience that when she first came into the world of tech, she was so committed to wanting to create more positive space for women. And she found, now she's been doing it for many, many years, and she said, the only thing that has ever been valuable for me as a woman in getting into different spaces is the fact that my name doesn't read as being a woman's name. I think her name is like Frankie or something like that. Something that when you see it on paper, it looks like she's a guy. And she said that after all of this space, after all the time, after all the money and access she herself has, that continuously the only reason why people invite her into a lot of different spaces is because her name makes people think that she's a guy. And so if we understand that even the most powerful among us are encountering these kinds of barriers, it is required that we do a greater kind of work to do this shifting. I think about the deaf community. The deaf community in Canada is underemployed by 80%. This is a huge community who wants to be able to work and actually could be thriving in so many tech spaces, particularly because of the ways in which tech spaces don't require the same kind of verbal communication. But again, if we're not willing to interrogate our own value systems and our own workspaces, we are not able to create these opportunities, and then this means that things are over in the interview even before people have an opportunity to affect that space. And we see that when people actually do make a control for bias, that things can be different. When the German Cancer Research Center hid the identity and gender of applicants to speak at its conference, a whopping 82% of invited speakers at the gathering were women. And this is in comparison to the previous year, where only 7% of the invited speakers were women. So huge. So again, so often when I hear from different people in different spaces, I've worked with Salesforce and a few different tech companies, and people say, you know, I'm just hiring people on the basis of their achievements and accomplishments. However, even the physical observance of someone's name as being gendered, or a name that might be from a country that you don't recognize, that alone can trigger that kind of implicit bias. So it's even more than our desires to want to be fair and equitable. Implicit bias makes that in and of itself a difficult process. Because we know tangibly that every time we increase the amount of women on a team, increase the number of diverse communities that are represented, that when that happens, innovation increases at the same time. That we are reflective in a country that brings people together from all around the world as settlers, as immigrants, in relationship to indigenous communities here, and we need all of each other. If we are creating something that looks very different from what we've inherited, we have to be able to recognize and celebrate the contributions of multiple different populations and different kinds of communities. It requires that we all examine our prejudice, myself too. None of us are exempt from that. And again, when we get caught up in these ideas of, I'm a good person, but this is about us all being people of character. And if we're asking ourselves as character, we have to be asking ourselves what kind of people we want to be. Who are we trying to be? What does integrity look like for us? And how does it show up in our value systems in the places that we work? Because we don't see things the way that they are, we see them the way that we are. I love showing this image. It's one of my favorite pictures to share in presentations. And I look at this, and a lot of the time when I ask, people I'm working with, like, what do you see? Like, what kind of image do you think this is representing? And people can never guess that it's actually a group of scientists at the Indian Space Station sending the very first satellite to Mars. That these are scientists. These are people who are working in this capacity, and I have never seen a scientist out of a lab coat in my life. This was the very first time I ever saw a representation that looked like it could be my auntie. It looked like it could be a part of my community to see that these women are actually involved in sending a satellite to Mars. And when we see images and representations that look like that challenge our perception of what professionalism looks like, that challenges our ideas of what intelligence and value looks like, that these kinds of images, again, reflect back to our population that this is who we want here. These are the values that we have. And when we let people show up exactly as they are, we allow people to come with their strongest contributions. And so again, when we're implementing this in a space, I think for me, a big part of it is how we integrate learning. How are we creating ongoing opportunities? We're not just doing a one-off workshop that we're checking off a box for. How are we integrating learning in a meaningful way into the ways that we are working? And for me, it's also about changing the culture. And it can happen, again, in very small ways. You wanted to change your name when you were young? My full name is Uzo Amaka. I came home one day and said, Mommy, can you call me Zoe? Without skipping a beat, she said, if they can learn how to say Tchaikovsky, Dostoevsky, and Michelangelo, they can learn how to say Uzo Amaka. And it's true, we can. The idea that we can't change our mouths or be able to reach across our own experiences to actually pronounce people's names is a huge part of saying that we're a culture that values people as they are. We value people named what they are. I think a lot of the time, people who have difficult names have described and recanted to me how often people will say, oh, we're just gonna call you Joe. Oh, we're just gonna call you. And I think that this is part of, again, how we say that we're not just asking you to minimize who you are. We want you to show up exactly the way you are because we know that that's the best way of having the greatest kinds of contributions from someone. It's also about policy, establishing clear written policy about what our value systems are. And whether it is about a product, we do this, I worked with a company and their value system around their product was about quality, value, and style. And every time they spoke to a customer or a client, they would let them know about the quality, value, and style of each product. And so when we were doing this work together, I would ask them, what is our policy? What are our values? What are the things that we're trying to transmit to people as they come into the workspace about who we are and what we do here? And how can we establish an organizational spiral? How can we establish ways of saying that we're constantly in a process of learning, refining, and innovating? There's never a place that we say that we're done because we're always open to learning and growth. And if we believe that there's always a possibility to get more profit and greater customers, then we can also at the same time believe that we can be better to each other, that we can create more inclusive spaces, more diverse spaces, and not be limited by the ways that we feel like things have been. Our behavior is something that is modeled over generations. We learned how to talk about race from our parents who did or didn't talk about race. And they learned from their parents who did or didn't talk about race. And often what we learned is to not talk about it at all. And there's absolutely no shame in that. It is difficult to have conversations about things that you don't know a lot about. And so it's understandable for all of us. It is a deeply human, connected experience to feel afraid of things that are unknown. But this is why we have an opportunity to, again, create something profoundly different. We can think that because we've always had it this way, or maybe we assume that everybody does it this way, that this is the only way that things will continue to happen. But what we know for sure, and the only thing we know for sure, is that everything changes. Everything grows, everything becomes different over time, and we have an opportunity to be at the forefront of this change, to be on the right side of the future, to be able to look back and to say in 20, 30 years that when I had a choice to make the difficult decision, but the one that was the most beneficial overall, I made that choice, and we are all the better for it. And there are so many examples of how we can leverage the privilege that we have access to. And so this is a good example. I like to talk about leveraging our privilege. We all have privilege. We all have things that we have power in. And this is one example where Jessica Chastain was on a movie with Octavia Spencer and found out that she was making 1/3 of what she was making. So the moment that she found that out, she reached out to her agent, she reached out to her negotiating team, and she got her added on to her own contract and got her salary raised up to be on par with hers. And this is one example to show that pay equity is one of the most basic ways that we can say to people, we value you in the same way as we do your peers. That your contribution is just as meaningful as people who have been doing this work in different kinds of ways and who have been represented in different kinds of ways. And so if we can imagine that our allyship card expires at the end of the day, every single day, and every day we want to renew it. We want to create the opportunity to do something different, to act in support of other people, and to use whatever privilege we have access to create more opportunities for the people around us. It doesn't have to be perfect to be valuable. I think, again, because of this conversation, maybe because of call-out culture, and we see things on people being dragged because of things that they're saying or mistakes that they're making, we can feel like if we don't know the right thing to say, we shouldn't say anything at all. But that is why it is so important to establish that kind of culture from the outset, to be able to allow us to understand and elevate mistakes so that we can learn from them, as opposed to pretending that we didn't make them at all. Brene Brown is really great in engaging in these conversations. I love the work that she does, and really inspires us to come to places of vulnerability and bravery. Because integrity is choosing courage over comfort, choosing what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy, and choosing to practice our values rather than simply professing them. And this is part of what I'm asking us all to do, to be able to live by our values, to establish them, and to be engaged in a process where we're allowed to be accountable with each other, and we're creating that space where we are also allowed to make mistakes. And in that same way that I want us to be allowed to make mistakes, I also want to invite us to step in, to slide in, to find our ways of intervening as bystanders when we see people in situations that may be difficult ones. And one of the things I like to say is to collect your folks, to reach out to people who have shared experiences of privilege, to be engaged in these conversations in ways that are long-term, so that we're really creating the opportunity for people to change. And I think that bystander, I'll go back to that last one, but I think that bystander intervention can be such a valuable thing in so many different ways. So I'm gonna share this one story. I was on the subway platform at Young and Bloor, and I was by myself, and someone who was visibly drunk started harassing me. They were sort of following me on the subway platform, and I was really nervous. I didn't know what to do, so I tried to move around, a whole bunch of business guys. I was like, I'm gonna stand in the middle of them, and hopefully they'll kind of block my path. Unfortunately, they didn't notice that I was there in any kind of way, and this guy kept harassing me. So I was like, what am I gonna do? And all of a sudden, this older white woman, her name is Susan. I know this now because Susan and I are friends. Susan walks by and locks eyes with me and says, oh my God, I haven't seen you in so long. Are you coming to the party tonight? And at first, I'm like, oh, wow, a lot's going on here. I was like, girl, I don't know you, actually. But then I realized, before I opened my mouth, luckily, then I realized what she was doing. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's so good to see you too. And she wrapped her arms around me, and she looked at the gentleman to my left and said, I'm sorry, we haven't seen each other in a really long time. We've got to go catch up. She put her arm around me and started walking me further down the platform, and he started walking away in the other direction. So I'm now walking arm in arm with this 5'11", 6 foot white woman, and we don't know each other, but we're hugging on the subway platform. And I'm just looking at her and asking her, why did you do that? She said, really plainly, well, I looked at you and I saw in your eyes and you looked scared. So I thought I should step in. And we kept talking a little bit more, and I said, weren't you scared? Weren't you worried about what was gonna happen? And she said, I know who I am, and I know what I look like, and I know that if anything was to happen, that people would all immediately step in and would protect me. And I understand that that probably wouldn't happen to you. And it was just this huge moment where two people who really don't have any reason to know each other than this decision that Susan made. And it's not as though Susan was thinking in the day, how am I thinking about principles of inclusion and diversity in my life? Am I really connecting with people who are different from me? What should I do? Susan was gonna get tea. She was not thinking about me in any kind of capacity. But because she was aware of her surroundings and paying attention to me and actually took that moment, now Susan and I have this really beautiful relationship. Susan came to my baby shower. Susan and I go for tea. I tell her about Drake. I put her on some new music. We have a really good vibe with each other. And we wouldn't have had that possibility if it wasn't for her, again, reaching out of her own experience, understanding, even in her own way, what her privilege would afford her, even if in that moment it was just safety or protection, and wanting to extend her privilege over me, wanting to extend the protection that she has access to over me until I can get to a place where I am safe. And this is one of the things I want us to be inspired to do, to find our inner Susans, to access this part of ourselves that knows what we have, that knows the power that we have, and wants to make sure that other people gain access to it too. That understands that we are more valuable when we are all on a playing field that allows us to participate. That really recognizes the strength of creating communities and workplaces where every single one of us is valued for the work that we do and valued for the contributions that we make. You can find me online, and you can also find this presentation online. It's a Prezi. I try to make all of my presentations accessible because I do want these to be the kinds of things that we get to share. I don't want us to feel afraid of these conversations. And again, when you find yourself in that moment feeling like, I can't do this and it is too hard, I really want us to tap into that sense of courage and integrity. And instead of turning away from each other, turn towards each other. Thank you.